The moment I saw the letter taped to my front door, I knew two things. Karen was at it again, and this time I wasn't going down without a fight. The HOA had already turned my life into a bureaucratic nightmare. Last year they fined me because my mailbox was an inch too tall, but banning my garden gnomes? That was a new level of insanity. I ripped the envelope open right there on my porch, my coffee cooling in my other hand, and read the ridiculous words printed in sterile, legal font. The gnomes, according to Corinne Delacroix, were a visual disruption that detracted from the overall aesthetic cohesion of the community. Translation. She hated them, and because she was the self-appointed queen of our neighborhood, she thought she could erase anything that didn't fit her bland, soulless vision of suburban perfection. I glanced at my front yard, where my little ceramic warriors stood proudly, one fishing, another reading a book, a few of them frozen in mid-dance, mischievous glee etched into their faces. They weren't hurting anyone. They weren't neon-colored monstrosities or grotesque statues of naked people. They were just gnomes. But that didn't matter to Karen. Nothing ever did unless it was in her favor. The thing about Karen was she didn't just enforce rules. She weaponized them. She roamed the neighborhood like some medieval tax collector, hunting for infractions no one else cared about. I'd seen her confront old Mrs. Jenkins about her sunflowers being too tall and argue with the Hendersons over their non-regulation bird feeder. And now, apparently, my harmless gnomes were the next victims in her ongoing quest for ultimate neighborhood control. I walked back inside, tossing the letter onto the counter where it landed next to a pile of similar warnings I'd received over the past few years. My best friend Ben was sitting at my kitchen table, nursing a soda and scrolling through his phone. He took one look at my face and sighed. "Karen, Karen," I confirmed, waving the letter like a battle flag. "What's it this time? Your grass is half an inch too long. Your trash cans blinked at her the wrong way. She's banning my garden gnomes." Ben nearly choked on his drink. "You're joking." "I wish." He set his phone down, rubbing his temples like this was giving him a headache, and in all fairness, it probably was. He'd dealt with plenty of Karen's antics, too. "You know what this means, right?" he said, leaning forward, eyes sparkling with that mischievous glee that usually led to very bad but very entertaining decisions. "You have to fight back." "Oh, I plan to. What's the move?" "I don't know yet," I admitted, "but it's going to be big." Before I could strategize further, my doorbell rang. A chill went down my spine. There was only one person who rang my doorbell like they were collecting a debt. I opened the door, and sure enough, there she was, Karen, clipboard in hand, standing like she'd been cast in stone herself. She was dressed in her usual uniform of judgment, beige slacks, an aggressively floral blouse, and a scowl that could curdle milk. "Jake," she said with that syrupy sweet tone that barely masked the steel underneath, "I assume you got my letter." "Oh, you mean the completely ridiculous and unnecessary letter about my harmless gnomes," I said, crossing my arms. Karen's eyes narrowed, but she kept her smile in place. "Rules are rules. We have to maintain the neighborhood's integrity. Karen, they're tiny statues. Do you hear yourself? You're acting like I built a nightclub in my front yard." She let out a theatrical sigh, as if I were the unreasonable one. "The HOA has spoken. If they're not gone by Friday, there will be fines. After that, legal action." My blood boiled. Legal action over gnomes. I didn't know what pissed me off more, the threat itself or the fact that she genuinely believed she had that kind of power over me. "Fine," I said, my voice calm but dripping with unspoken war declarations. "You win. The gnomes will be gone." Karen's lips curled into a victorious smirk. "Glad to hear it." I watched her march away, probably off to ruin someone else's day, but inside my mind was already spinning. The gnomes would be gone, yes, but in their place. Oh, in their place would be something far worse, something that would make Karen regret ever setting her sights on my lawn. Ben, who had been watching from the doorway, let out a low whistle as Karen disappeared down the street. "Dude, that was ominous." I turned to him, a slow grin spreading across my face. "Good, because I have an idea." By the time Karen reached the end of the block, I was already searching online for the most ridiculous, most outrageous, most nightmare-inducing alternative I could find. Something technically within the rules, but guaranteed to make her regret messing with me. That's when I saw them, 7-foot gargoyle statues, grotesque, looming, Gothic perfection. I could already imagine them standing in my yard, casting ominous shadows over Karen's pristine hedges. If she thought gnomes were offensive, these would give her a full-blown existential crisis. Ben peered over my shoulder, his eyes widening. Oh, this is evil." This, I said, clicking Add to Cart, is just the beginning. By the time the delivery truck pulled up in front of my house 2 days later, I had already prepared myself for the absolute chaos that was about to unfold. The driver stepped out, took one look at the massive wooden crates stacked in the truck bed, then back at me with a raised eyebrow. "You sure you ordered these?" he asked. "Oh, I'm sure," I said, grinning. He gave a slow whistle and shook his head as he wheeled the first crate down the ramp. One by one, the gargoyles arrived, each carefully wrapped in layers of protective padding. Even through the thick covering, I could tell they were massive, 7 feet of pure, ominous stone glory. Just the thought of Corinne's reaction had me practically giddy. Ben showed up right as I was prying open the first crate. He took one look at the statue inside and burst out laughing. "Oh man," he said, stepping back to take in the full sight of it, "Corinne is going to lose her mind." "Good," I said, running a hand over the rough, gray surface. "That's the point." It took the better part of the afternoon to get all the statues arranged in just the right positions. They stood in a perfect line along the edge of my lawn, towering over the sidewalk like a silent, menacing army. Each one was carved in exquisite, terrifying detail, sharp claws, wide wings, snarling mouths frozen in mid-roar. They were in every possible way the complete opposite of the tiny, harmless gnomes Corinne had so viciously condemned. I stepped back to admire my work, arms crossed, heart pounding with satisfaction. Ben let out another low whistle. "You think she's seen them yet?" I glanced toward Corinne's house. The curtains in her front window twitched. "Oh, she's seen them." The neighborhood's reaction was immediate and exactly as I'd hoped. People stopped in their tracks while walking their dogs. A group of kids on bikes swerved to a halt, staring with a mix of awe and fear. A woman jogging by literally gasped and crossed the street. It didn't take long before my phone buzzed, a message from the HOA group chat. The first was from Corinne, of course. "At Jake Thompson, remove those immediately. This is unacceptable." I stared at my phone, debating my response, then decided to keep it simple. No rule against them. Almost immediately, the chat exploded. Some neighbors found it hilarious, others were horrified, and a few brave souls even expressed admiration for my commitment to pushing back against the HOA's absurdity. Corinne, however, was not amused. Not even 10 minutes later, she was storming across my lawn, clipboard in hand, fury radiating off her like an overheating engine. "Jake," she barked, stopping just short of the closest gargoyle. "This is harassment." I leaned against my porch railing, pretending to examine my nails. "Corinne, I don't think you know what that word means." She gestured wildly at the statues. "This is an eyesore. This is intimidation." "This is perfectly within the rules," I finished for her. "Show me in the HOA guidelines where it says I can't have decorative statues in my yard." Corinne's mouth opened and closed, her face growing redder by the second. She flipped through her clipboard, scanning the pages as if she'd magically find some obscure bylaw that would work in her favor. But she wouldn't, because I'd already checked. Corinne's nostrils flared as she stood there, clutching her clipboard like a lifeline. "This is a disgrace to the neighborhood," she spat. "That's a matter of opinion," I replied coolly. "I think they add character." She took a deep breath, as if trying to compose herself, but it didn't work. Her scowl deepened. "I will be calling an emergency HOA meeting to have these removed," she declared. "Good luck with that," I said, unable to hide the smirk creeping onto my face. With one last glare, Corinne spun on her heel and marched away, muttering under her breath. Ben shook his head, watching her go. "She's going to lose sleep over this." "I hope so." For the rest of the evening, I watched as more neighbors reacted to my little rebellion. Some came by to take pictures, others just stood at a distance, shaking their heads. My personal favorite was Old Man Peterson, who laughed so hard he had to sit down on his porch. By the next morning, Corinne had made good on her threat. Flyers had been stuffed into every mailbox on the block, summoning everyone to an emergency HOA meeting at her house. I took my time getting there, making sure to show up just a few minutes late, purely to irritate her. The room was packed when I arrived. Corinne stood at the front looking smug as she tapped a stack of papers against the table. The second she saw me, she straightened. "Ah, Jake," she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness. "So glad you could join us." I gave her a lazy salute and took a seat. She cleared her throat. "We are here today to address a serious violation of our community's aesthetic standards." "Which rule was violated?" I asked, tilting my head. She shot me a look that could have melted steel. "We're proposing a new bylaw." I leaned back in my chair, stretching out my legs. So, to be clear, I didn't actually break any rules, Karen's eye twitched. A murmur ran through the room. Some people looked uncomfortable, clearly aware of the hypocrisy at play, while others, Karen's loyal minions, nodded along, eager to back her up. She adjusted her blouse, regaining her composure. It is within the HOA's rights to create new regulations when necessary to preserve the integrity of the neighborhood. Which really just means whenever you don't like something, I muttered, her jaw clenched. A vote will be held to determine whether oversized, inappropriate lawn decorations will be banned, she continued, ignoring me. I could feel the room shift. Some people clearly wanted to support Karen, but the way she framed it made it obvious she was only doing this because she was personally offended. I sat forward, resting my elbows on my knees. I just think it's funny how small, harmless gnomes were a problem, but when I followed the rules, suddenly there needs to be a new law. Sounds a little unfair, don't you think? The murmurs grew louder. Ben, who had been sitting quietly at the back, finally spoke up. I mean, if we're banning things that make people uncomfortable, maybe we should talk about Karen's attitude. Laughter erupted across the room. Even some of Karen's usual supporters couldn't hide their smirks. Karen's face burned crimson. This is not a joke. I stood up, shoving my hands in my pockets. I agree, it's not a joke, it's about control. And I don't think everyone here wants to live in a neighborhood where one person gets to decide what's acceptable for the rest of us. Silence fell, then, one by one, people started nodding. Karen saw it too. She saw her control slipping through her fingers, and I saw something else. Panic. I turned toward the door. See you around, Karen? And with that, I walked out. But I knew this wasn't over, not yet, because Karen wasn't the type to lose gracefully. She was going to come back at me even harder, and I was ready. I knew she wouldn't back down easily. The vote at the HOA meeting hadn't gone in her favor, and the look on her face when she realized she was losing had been almost worth all the trouble. Almost. Because if there was one thing I'd learned about Karen, it was that she never accepted defeat. She was the type to plot, to scheme, to find a way to get what she wanted, even if it meant bending the rules until they cracked. I just didn't expect her to be so bold about it. The first sign of trouble came 2 nights later. I had just finished watching a movie when a motion alert from my security cameras popped up on my phone. My stomach tightened. I wasn't expecting any visitors. Opening the app, I saw movement in my front yard, a dark figure creeping between the gargoyles, pausing every few steps like they were trying not to be seen. I squinted at the screen, then laughed out loud when I realized who it was, Karen, dressed in black, holding what looked like a crowbar. For a moment, I just watched in disbelief. Was she really this desperate? Was she actually trying to remove my gargoyles herself? The absurdity of it was almost impressive. She must have assumed I was asleep, thinking she could get away with her little heist unnoticed. What she didn't know was that I'd planned for something like this. Karen wasn't just predictable, she was stubborn, and I'd taken precautions. I grabbed my phone, switching to the speaker system attached to my front porch. Using my best deep, demonic voice, I spoke directly through the hidden speakers near the statues. "Leave this place, mortal." Karen froze. The crowbar slipped from her grip, clattering against the pavement. She spun in circles, looking around wildly. "The Guardians are watching," I said, letting my voice echo through the yard. Karen let out a strangled gasp, took a shaky step back, then another before turning on her heel and sprinting full speed across my lawn. She didn't stop until she reached her house, slamming the door behind her. I couldn't breathe from laughing so hard. The next morning, I expected her to march over and confront me, but instead, she went silent, too silent. I should have known she was planning something worse. By the afternoon, I received an official letter from the HOA. This one was different from the usual warnings or fines. It was an official complaint stating that my gargoyles were a public safety hazard, and that legal action would be pursued if they weren't removed immediately. Attached was a petition with signatures from some of Karen's more devoted followers, all claiming the statues were aggressive, disturbing, and disruptive to community peace. I clenched my jaw. She failed to get me to remove them with a rule change, and now she was trying to make it a legal issue. But the problem with Karen was that she always underestimated me. She assumed I wouldn't be prepared for this, that I'd cave under the pressure of legal threats. What she didn't know was that I had a lawyer, technically my cousin, but he still knew his stuff. When I showed him the letter, he barely glanced at it before shaking his head. "She doesn't have a case," he said. "This is all nonsense. That won't stop her from trying." "No, but it does mean you can fight back." That was exactly what I did. I had a counterletter drafted, filled with legal jargon that essentially boiled down to, "You have no authority here." I sent it to the HOA board, making sure Karen got a personal copy. When she saw me later that day, she refused to look in my direction, her lips pressed together so tightly they'd practically disappeared. The battle wasn't over, but it was shifting. She'd lost her leverage, and I could feel it. Then the final blow came. One of the neighbors, one of Karen's former allies, leaked security footage of her attempted midnight break-in to the HOA's private community forum. Within minutes, the entire neighborhood was talking about it. Karen tried to steal his gargoyles. She was sneaking around in the middle of the night. This is ridiculous. People who'd previously supported her started to question if they'd been backing the right side. Whispers of an HOA leadership change began circulating. For the first time, Karen was the one under scrutiny. She'd spent so long controlling everyone else that she never stopped to consider the same rules could be used against her. A week later, the vote was held. Karen was officially removed from her position as HOA president. It wasn't even close. Karen didn't take her removal from the HOA presidency well. In fact, she packed up her things and moved within a month. No one was particularly sad to see her go. I heard rumors that she tried to enforce rules in her new neighborhood, but they weren't nearly as tolerant of her antics. Some said she got kicked out of that HOA within weeks. As for me, I kept the gargoyles, not just because I'd won, but because in a weird way, they'd become a symbol of something bigger. A reminder that standing up to people like Karen was worth it, that ridiculous rules and unnecessary control didn't have to be accepted just because someone said so. The neighborhood changed after she left. It was still an HOA, sure, but without Karen pulling the strings, things became more relaxed. People started decorating their homes the way they wanted, planting the flowers they liked, putting up decorations without fear of ridiculous fines. It wasn't perfect, but it was better, and that was enough for me. One afternoon, I was sitting on my porch when Ben walked up, shaking his head as he looked at the gargoyles. "Still can't believe you kept them," he said, plopping down in the chair next to me. "They grew on me," I admitted, taking a sip of my coffee. He smirked. "You know, we could add LED lights, really complete the look." I laughed, leaning back in my chair. "Let's give the new HOA president some time to breathe, then we'll see." For now, though, I was just going to enjoy the victory. The gargoyles stood there, silent and imposing, a testament to the chaos they'd caused and the power they'd unintentionally stripped from Karen. Every time I looked at them, I couldn't help but smile. They were more than just statues now. They were a story, a battle one, a middle finger to petty tyranny. And the best part, they were still perfectly within the rules. The weeks that followed Karen's departure were quiet, almost too quiet. I kept expecting some kind of parting shot, a final act of spite from her, but it never came. Maybe she'd finally learned her lesson, or maybe she was just too busy terrorizing her new neighbors to bother with me anymore. Either way, I didn't care. My lawn was mine again, and the gargoyles were staying. The neighborhood gossip eventually died down, though the story of Karen's midnight crowbar escapade became something of a local legend. People still brought it up at barbecues or when new residents moved in. "You should have seen it. She ran like the devil himself was after her." And I'd just nod and grin, happy to let the tale grow taller with each retelling. Ben, of course, never let me forget it either. He'd taken to calling the gargoyles the guardians after my little speaker stunt, and I had to admit the name stuck. One day, old Mrs. Jenkins from down the street stopped by while I was watering my plants. She'd always been one of the few who didn't bow to Karen's reign of terror, and I respected her for it. "You know," she said, eyeing the gargoyles with a twinkle in her eye, "I think they suit you, Jake. They've got spirit." "Thanks," I said, chuckling. "They've caused enough trouble to earn their keep." She nodded, then added, "You did us all a favor getting rid of her. I've got my sunflowers back up taller than ever." I glanced across the street, and sure enough, her yard was bursting with bright yellow blooms, defiant and free. "Glad to hear it," I replied. She gave me a conspiratorial wink before shuffling off, and I couldn't help but feel a little proud. The gargoyles weren't just my victory, they'd sparked something in the whole neighborhood, a quiet rebellion against the Karens of the world. As spring rolled into summer, the neighborhood continued to loosen up in ways I hadn't expected. The absence of Karen's iron grip seemed to breathe new life into the place. Front yards that had once been manicured to soulless perfection started sprouting personality. The Hendersons put up a wild, multicolored birdhouse that would have sent Karen into a fit, and someone down the street even installed a little free library shaped like a rocket ship. My gargoyles, though, remained the unofficial mascots of this newfound freedom. People would wave as they passed by, some even stopping to snap selfies with the towering stone figures. I didn't mind. It was nice to see them embraced instead of feared or despised. Ben kept joking that I should start charging for photo ops, but I was content just watching the shift happen. The HOA still existed, of course, but the new president, a laid-back guy named Tom, seemed more interested in keeping the peace than enforcing petty rules. One evening I was tinkering with my sprinklers when Tom himself strolled up, hands in his pockets, a sheepish grin on his face. "Hey, Jake," he said, nodding toward the gargoyles. "Gotta say, these things are growing on me. They've got a certain charm." "Told you they add character," I replied, wiping my hands on a rag. He chuckled. "Yeah, well, they've also scared off a couple of door-to-door salesmen, so I'd say they're doing double duty. Happy to help." He hesitated, then added, "You know, some folks were worried when Karen left that things would fall apart around here, but it's been the opposite. I think you shook things up in a good way." I shrugged. "I just wanted my gnomes back. The rest was collateral damage." Tom laughed outright at that. "Well, keep the gargoyles. They're a hit." He clapped me on the shoulder and wandered off, leaving me with a strange sense of satisfaction, not just from winning, but from seeing the ripple effect of standing my ground. A few days later, Ben showed up with a six-pack and a grin that spelled trouble. "I've been thinking," he said, cracking open a beer and handing me one. "You've got the gargoyles right, but what if we take it up a notch? Halloween's coming. Imagine these bad boys with fog machines and red lights in their eyes." I nearly spit out my drink. "You're insane." "I'm a visionary," he corrected, sprawling out on my porch steps. "Think about it. Karen might have moved, but her spirit's still out there, haunting some other poor neighborhood. This could be our tribute to keeping her ghost away." I couldn't argue with that logic. It was ridiculous but tempting. "Let's see how Tom feels about it first," I said. "Don't want to push our luck too soon." Ben groaned dramatically but agreed, and we spent the rest of the night brainstorming increasingly absurd ideas, from gargoyle costumes to a full-on haunted yard setup. By the time he left, I was half convinced we'd end up doing something stupid, and half excited about it. The next week I got an unexpected visitor, one of Karen's old loyalists, a mousy woman named Linda who'd signed that public safety hazard petition. She stood on my porch fidgeting with her purse, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. "Jake," she started, barely meeting my eyes, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry about the gargoyle thing. Karen had us all wound up and I didn't think it through." I leaned against the doorframe, surprised but not entirely shocked. Karen's influence had been strong, but it wasn't unbreakable. "No hard feelings," I said. "She was good at dragging people into her mess." Linda nodded, relieved. "They're kind of cool, actually, the statues. My kids love them." "Glad to hear it," I replied, and she scurried off, leaving me with the realization that even Karen's diehards were coming around. The gargoyles really were winning hearts, one neighbor at a time. By the time fall arrived, the gargoyles had cemented their status as neighborhood icons. The air turned crisp, leaves piled up in yards, and Halloween decorations started popping up everywhere, pumpkins, skeletons, the usual, but Ben wasn't about to let my lawn be outdone. True to his word, he showed up one Saturday with a fog machine, a string of red LED lights, and a determination that bordered on obsession. "We're doing this," he announced, dumping the gear on my porch. "Tom's cool with it," I checked. "Said as long as we don't burn the place down, he's got no complaints." I raised an eyebrow but couldn't resist the grin tugging at my lips. "Fine, but if we get fined for this, you're paying." "Deal," he said, already unraveling the lights. We spent the afternoon rigging up the setup, tucking the LEDs into the gargoyles' eye sockets, positioning the fog machine to billow mist around their clawed feet. By dusk, the effect was complete. The statues loomed through the haze, their eyes glowing an eerie red, looking every bit like sentinels from some gothic nightmare. The reaction was instantaneous. Kids trick-or-treating that night shrieked with delight, dragging their parents over to gawk. A few teenagers dared each other to touch the statues, scattering when the fog thickened. Even Tom swung by, chuckling as he snapped a picture. "You two are something else," he said, shaking his head. "This might be the best thing on the block." "Told you," Ben whispered, elbowing me. Word spread fast. By the next evening, cars were slowing down as they passed, and I caught a couple of neighbors sneaking photos from across the street. It was ridiculous, over the top, and exactly the kind of chaos I'd come to love about this whole saga. The gargoyles weren't just decorations anymore. They were a spectacle, a shared joke, a victory lap. And somewhere out there, I hoped Karen was hearing about it and grinding her teeth in frustration. After Halloween, I left the lights up for a while, not because I was too lazy to take them down, but because they'd grown on me, just like the gargoyles themselves. The neighborhood settled into a new rhythm, one where people weren't afraid to push boundaries a little. Mrs. Jenkins added a gnome to her sunflower patch, a subtle nod to my original fight, and the Hendersons swapped their birdhouse for an even gaudier one shaped like a flamingo. It was small stuff, but it felt like a quiet revolution, one Karen would have hated. Ben kept the momentum going, too, dropping by every so often with new ideas. "What about Christmas lights?" he suggested one chilly afternoon, sipping hot cocoa on my porch. "Green and red in the eyes, maybe some tinsel," I laughed. "Let's not scare Santa off just yet." But I was already picturing it, and part of me knew we'd probably do it eventually, because why not? Then, just before Thanksgiving, I got a letter, not from the HOA this time, but from Linda, the former Karen loyalist. She scribbled a note on a little card, tucked inside an envelope with a drawing of a gargoyle on it. "Jake," it read, "the kids made this for you. They're calling it the Gargoyle House now. Thanks for making things fun again." Inside was a crayon sketch of my yard, complete with lopsided statues and glowing eyes. I stuck it on my fridge, grinning like an idiot. It hit me then, this wasn't just about beating Karen anymore. It was about what came after, the way people rallied around something silly and turned it into something bigger. The gargoyles had started as a petty act of defiance, but they'd ended up as a weird little legacy. And as the holidays approached, I couldn't help but wonder what else they, and we, could get away with next. Winter crept in, blanketing the neighborhood in a thin layer of frost, and the gargoyles took on a new kind of menace with icicles dangling from their claws. I decided to lean into Ben's Christmas idea after all. Why not keep the streak alive? We draped them in green and red lights, wrapped some tinsel around their wings, and even perched a Santa hat on the biggest one's head. The result was absurdly festive, like a Gothic holiday fever dream, and the neighbors ate it up. People started leaving little gifts at the base of the statues, candy canes, ornaments, even a tiny scarf someone knitted for one of the smaller ones. It became a sort of unspoken tradition, a way for everyone to join in on the fun. Tom, the new HOA president, stopped by with a thermos of mulled wine one evening, grinning as he surveyed the scene. "You've turned this place into a landmark, Jake," he said, handing me a mug. "I'm not even mad, it's good for morale." I clinked my mug against his, happy to serve. Gargoyle House, as the kids had dubbed it, became a minor legend beyond our street. A local blog picked up the story, complete with pictures of the Halloween setup and the Christmas makeover, calling it the most delightfully petty rebellion against HOA tyranny. Ben sent me the link with a string of laughing emojis, and I had to admit, it felt good to see it written out like that. Karen's name wasn't mentioned, but it didn't need to be. Anyone who'd lived through her reign knew who the real villain was. The article got some traction online, and for a week or two, I'd catch strangers driving by, pointing and snapping photos. It was weird, but I didn't mind. The gargoyles had earned their fame. By New Year's, the neighborhood felt like a different place entirely. People waved more, chatted longer, even threw impromptu block parties without worrying about noise complaints or clipboard-wielding enforcers. Karen's absence had left a vacuum, and we'd filled it with something better. One snowy afternoon, I was shoveling my walkway when Mrs. Jenkins shuffled over, bundled in a coat and scarf. "You know," she said, her breath puffing in the cold air, "I got a postcard from Karen the other day. She's in some gated community now, still complaining about her neighbor's flower pots." I snorted, leaning on my shovel. "Some things never change." "Nope," she agreed, then smirked. "But you sure changed things here." She nodded toward the gargoyles, sparkling with frost and tinsel. "Keep 'em up, Jake. They're our guardians now." I watched her trudge back to her house, feeling an odd mix of pride and amusement. She was right. They were guardians, in a way, watching over a neighborhood that had learned to laugh at itself a little more. As the year turned over, I sat on my porch with Ben, sipping beers and watching the snow fall. The gargoyles stood silent, their lights flickering faintly through the flakes. "So," he said, kicking his feet up on the railing, "what's next? Easter eggs in their mouths, 4th of July sparklers." I laughed, shaking my head. "Let's just enjoy the quiet for a bit." He grinned. "Fair enough, but you know this isn't over. Someone's gotta top this eventually." "Let 'em try," I said, clinking my bottle against his. The gargoyles stayed through the seasons, a permanent fixture of defiance and delight. Karen was gone, her rules were fatting, and the neighborhood was ours again, messy, weird, and free. And every time I looked at those stone monsters, I couldn't help but think it was all worth it. The letters, the fights, the crowbar-dropping panic. Because in the end, it wasn't just about winning, it was about what we built after. And that, I decided, was the real victory.